What if somebody told you that the Allies did not win World War II? Would you reject the notion? What if somebody told you that the U.S. government was heavily infiltrated in the 1930s by agents of the Soviet Union, and that Franklin Roosevelt's administration was manipulated by the communists into entering the war as an ally of the Soviet Union? That somebody is on the telephone right now. Diana West is a columnist and an author. Her newest book is American Betrayal, The Secret Assault on Our Nation's Character. Her website is dianawest.com. Diana, welcome to True News.
Thank you very much, Rick. I can tell I'm in the right place.
Well, I'm looking forward to this interview. Anytime that we can expose the lies of the communists that have infiltrated this country throughout the 20th century and now in full control of the White House, I want to bring that guest on this program and give that person all the freedom and liberty possible to tell the truth. So, and we'll get to Mr. Obama later as time permits, because I think he is the culmination of what you're going to tell us about was happening in the 1930s. So let's. Where do we start? Where do we start in this story about this overthrow of the United States? That's what it is. It is a
Second American Revolution.
Yes,
perhaps.
It is.
Well, the beginning is certainly with the overthrow of Russia and the Russian Revolution in 1917, which brought this revolutionary government into being called the Soviet Union. That was actually its purpose, its open stated goal, its strategy was to overthrow the rest of the world and impose the teachings of Marx, and then Marxism-Leninism, and then we get to Stalin. Now, 4 American presidents, beginning in 1917, refused to recognize this revolutionary government, knowing full well that you could not have, quote, normal, or even normal without quotes, relations with a government designed toward your, or calculating towards your own destruction. This was obviously, you could not have agreements, they would be broken, you could not have any kind of deals or alliances. And so this government was shunned by the United States until 1933. And that was the year in November when Franklin Roosevelt, then in his very first term, recognized the Soviet Union, normalized relations. And I argue that this is a very logical place to take up this story of the overthrow of the United States, as you put it, of the Second American Revolution, as other writers in our past have noted. And what it introduced, what your show is all about, really, it introduced this in an institutional way, I believe, into American history, into American governance, into our institutions. And this was lying, the big lie. Indeed, in that act of recognition, which was based on a set of promises, really, it's a short agreement that was actually signed to normalize relations. It's essentially a set of promises that the Soviet Union made to us that it would not try to overthrow us. It essentially restated this in many different ways. The Soviet Union promised not to support cadres of secret agents in our country, for example, as a term of this normalization. Well, this was already underway. We already had the infiltration beginning, Soviet-directed, a Communist Party-directed. However, it certainly increased exponentially with this agreement. And what I discovered at a certain point in my research was that in order to perpetuate this alliance, to continue relations with the Soviet Union, which became really an obsession of American governments from that day forward, the American government had to learn to lie to the people and tell us lies about communism, tell us lies about Stalin, tell us lies about the Soviet Union. And I think in some way, this is where we see the rise of double standards. I think we also see the rise eventually of moral relativism, cultural relativism. These ills that we see in our culture today, I think, have their roots in this relationship. And so I would just begin but with this very beginning, because I think it was that important. November 16, 1933, the day we recognized the Soviet Union.
And Diana, I think we need to state that the Bolshevik Revolution, which overthrew the Russian people and carried out a massive number of murders of Russian Christian priests, the Orthodox churches, tens of millions of Russians put to death. The Bolshevik Revolution was only possible because the leaders of it had funding and secret support from some of the biggest and richest men and institutions in the United States. And I'm specifically talking about the Rockefellers, and I'm talking about the New York Federal Reserve Bank.
Yeah.
There is a paper trail showing the money flowing to the Bolshevik Revolution from the New York Federal Reserve. And so there were people and institutions in America who were secretly funding the Bolshevik Revolution. And so we have to step back and ask, why? What was the strategy? What were they doing? And how are we falling for the deception today?
Well, are you talking about people who believed in global government, who were interested in converging the capitalist system with the communist system? Yes. Well, this was something that Roosevelt himself believed in, convergence. And I suppose the money people you're talking about came out of that same mindset and were promoting that same mindset and were indeed the influences on Roosevelt in making this decision. It was an extraordinary decision because, for example, and this is something that Alexander Solzhenitsyn would talk about in later years, the Allies were always, or the Western governments, the Western democracies, were always hostile to Tsarist Russia. And Solzhenitsyn made the point that this was very strange given the record of the Bolshevik government coming in terms of body count. And he talked about this, that in pre-revolutionary times, the Tsarist government executed about 17 political prisoners a year. Now, he compared this to the Spanish Inquisition, which at its height, he said, destroyed 10 people a month. So we've got an uptick there. But in those early revolutionary years, the new Bolshevik secret police, executed without trial more than 1,000 people per month. Later in the 1930s, Stalin was killing tens of thousands of people per month. And yet the United States rushed into alliance, rushed to recognize the Soviet government under Roosevelt during World War II, rushed into this alliance. And yet we consider, even in our lore, our minds, that Tsarist Russia was so much worse. And this is part of the same mythology. And this was something that Solzhenitsyn could never understand. And what you're talking about is helps fill in some of these gaps in terms of the global economic forces that were definitely pushing in this direction. For what reason, what was really going on in their minds, in their souls, I cannot say.
Several months ago, I was interviewing a financial newsletter writer, and we were talking about what I said. I believe that the capitalists will merge with the communists, and he didn't agree with that, and he wrote an email to me after the interview, politely disagreeing. And I wrote back to him and I said, "Look, China is run by communist capitalists, and America is run by capitalist communists."
Yeah. I think that's true. I think that the convergence has happened with, namely, except perhaps in the Chinese situation where they have learned to capitalize on capitalism, even as they've remained a very tight dictatorship. I think that the United States has been much more transformed by this experience than the communist systems are, certainly in terms of culture, certainly in terms of liberty. I don't believe liberty is opened up in the communist world the way that communism has taken liberty from us in our world. And this was always the pattern, even as FDR was plotting convergence with Stalin's Russia. It was always one way. And it was always pushed along by definitely the influence artists who were in the government working directly for Roosevelt, who I do believe were conditioning him. He was a very ill man as time went on. He really had no business remaining in office so long, given his physical condition in that last term of his, in which he died, of course, in 1945. He was essentially brain dead for much of the time. We have been able to piece together. There's a marvelous book called Stalin's Secret Agents by Stanton Evans, where he goes through the actual health condition of Roosevelt, which is just an extraordinary thought when you realize the kinds of crucial decisions that the U.S. government was somehow making with the commander-in-chief incapacitated much of the time. And so you go again to these advisors, many of whom we later learned confirmed after archives opened on the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, we later learned many of these senior officials in the United States government were working for Stalin. They were Soviet agents. They were Americans. They were, completely fooling their colleagues, many of them, most of them, and yet later on we discover the people pulling the levers, pushing the papers, shaping policy were actually espionage agents. And this branch of espionage, the influence operation, is usually not treated when people think of espionage. They think of spies running around in disguises and stealing secrets and passing bomb plans, things like that, which of course is what Hollywood can dramatize, and it kind of has imprinted itself on our imagination, and even in academia, this is what is normally studied. However, the influence operation is much more poisonous, because, first of all, it's very hard to trace unless you have the identity of the agent, and it can have repercussions beyond time and space. And I think that's what we're looking at.
And Diana, when you're talking about people who were inside the White House and in the administration and the various cabinet agencies of Franklin Roosevelt, you're not saying that they were just idealistic socialists who were, dreaming of a new world order, or that they were just communist dupes. You're saying they were sold out Soviet agents.
Yes. Now there was the former variety that you described, plenty of those, but at the top there was a cadre, a large cadre of well-placed, hardened agents whose names appear in the secret Soviet security police archives that we gained a look at in the 1990s, beginning in the 1990s. This would include Lachlan Curry, who worked directly for Roosevelt in the White House. He had the China portfolio. His job at a certain point was to make sure that China went communist, which it did. You had Harry Hopkins, who is a controversial figure to this day. I lay out in great detail my dossier charging Harry Hopkins with being a conscious agent of Stalin. That is still an open controversy with many intelligence historians believing he was an unconscious agent. Well, I was able to pull together enough evidence of his conscious informing to the Soviet embassy, passing along secrets to the Soviet spy master, and so on, that ultimately tells me that he was acting consciously to further the Soviet aims. You had Alger Hiss, the most famous, because there actually was a trial in the middle of the last century that confirmed him found him guilty of perjury related to his Soviet espionage. He was in the State Department. The list goes on. There are cells, the Silvermaster cell, the Perlow group. These were cells winging out throughout Treasury, the State Department, Agricultural Department, in the OSS, where you had the senior assistant to the very famous Wild Bill Donovan, a man named Duncan Lee, Soviet agent. One of his best friends in the OSS, another man considered one of the most productive Soviet sources ever, Duncan Lee didn't even realize that he was a Soviet agent. The cells were that discreet, they were that walled off from one another, they were that successful in terms of preserving their cover. You have, of course, Harry Dexter White, who was a senior Treasury official, who is considered by one and all across the board, the intelligence historians, the senior-most Soviet agent or senior-most American official in the Soviet hierarchy. Again, an American who was doing Stalin's bidding and was very successful at this in many instances, which we can actually discuss if you care to. But this is just giving people a sense of the names that we now know were actually leading what I argue in my book, American Betrayal, the communist occupation of Washington, D.C., that began in the 1930s, and I argue manipulated American war policy throughout World War II. And this, I know, is a very controversial claim because I grew up, just as every other American, looking back at World War II, of which my father was a veteran, in fact, of the Normandy invasion, D-Day +2. I look back on with other Americans with great pride at what Americans were able to do and to liberate Europe and so on, and defeat Japan. However, I don't feel the same way about that war anymore, and I'm convinced that if my father were still living, that he would also greatly question what he had actually participated in, because at a certain point, and this is very much laid out in great detail in my book, it became clear to me that, again, the Soviet Union was manipulating the American war effort and the British war effort as well in order to defeat Hitler, to supplant him with Stalin. And this is exactly what happened. The logic of the map is what tells us that what I'm saying has credence, because when you look at that post-war map, what happened? There is a devastated Germany, and in that vacuum, there is a new, thriving, powerful, U.S.-supplied Soviet empire in its place.
Diana, you just took the words out of my mouth. What I was getting ready to say. I mean, World War II. The result was, I was getting ready to ask you this. The result of World War II was a greatly expanded Soviet Union with far more territory under their control, and it was the defeat of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, who were socialists. It was the National Socialist Party, and Stalin saw Hitler as his rival for control of the global communist movement.
Exactly.
And that's what this was all about.
Right. That's what this is all about. And here's I call the book American Betrayal because it is an American betrayal of our people, of our wonderful soldiers and veterans and Americans who, participated in all of these efforts across the century. It's not an indictment of us. It's an indictment of them being the elites. I discovered, and I have the documents to back it up in the book, and I hope your listeners take the time to read it to see if they think I'm right. But I believe that World War II could have ended as very, very likely in 1943, perhaps 1942, but definitely 1943, and would have ended in 1943 had Washington not been communist occupied. And here's why. There was a very significant, highly placed anti-Nazi German resistance. Now, this is something I knew nothing about growing up, and well into adulthood until I started doing this research. This resistance was as high as the German intelligence chief, a man named Canaris, Admiral Canaris, who was doing his best to work to the Allies' benefit because he did not like Hitler, he did not like Nazism. It was in the German clergy, it was throughout the military, higher ranks of the military, and in the business class as well. There were different cadres of these anti-Nazi German resistance movements throughout Germany at this time, working at tremendous peril to their lives, and indeed thousands of them would be executed by Hitler before the war was out. These groups, as early as 1942, were attempting, and actually before the war itself, but the very significant movement begins in 1942 in my book, were attempting to reach out to the Roosevelt White House and at least establish secret modes of communication. They asked for Roosevelt to make speeches about what kind of Germany he envisioned post-Hitler. This was the early kinds of movements. Later on, with this military involvement, you had actual offers to the United States and Britain of delivery of the Nazi high command on a platter, the surrender of the German armies to the Americans and the British in return for help keeping the Red Army out of Germany, out of Eastern Europe, out of Central Europe. Because at this point in the war, in 1943, the Red Army was still in Russia. It was not in Europe yet. They were still fighting over way in the east. There was one problem with this anti-Nazi German resistance. They were anti-communist. And for this reason, they were stopped at every turn. And this is where that penetration is so significant. For example, I found one line of their probe for assistance going straight to Lachlan Curry, whom I mentioned before was in the White House and a bona fide dead-to-rights Soviet agent who turned it back. At the OSS, which of course is a precursor to the CIA, you have another KGB agent on the German desk, Franz Neumann. He is the one charged with characterizing and studying this resistance. And of course, he characterized and studied it as something that we didn't want to have anything to do with. I mean, this is the kind of impact that the penetration had. There are other stories. There are other people, Americans, charged, emissaries of Roosevelt, actually, in Europe, acting in good faith, trying to take these offers through to the White House. Who do they run into? Harry Hopkins.
Dinah, what about General Patton? We know that throughout World War II, his hands were repeatedly tied.
Yes.
He was not allowed to carry out the battles that he wanted to fight, and he was very frustrated. Let's talk about the actual war, and then we'll talk about what happened to Patton after the war. But during the war, who was blocking General Patton? Who was tying his hands?
Well, this would be, of course, ultimately it would be General Marshall, who is the Army Chief of Staff. General Marshall owed his job, he certainly believed, to Harry Hopkins. He had been promoted over the heads of many generals into this position. He was very tightly allied with Hopkins. He said something to his biographer, his official biographer, in well after all of these events in the 1950s, in conversation that I quote in the book because it is such a curious and disturbing point. And I paraphrase at the moment, but he basically said, I represented the American interest to President Roosevelt, and Harry Hopkins represented the Russian interest.
General Marshall, he said, that's a quote from General Marshall?
He said that. I can find you the exact quote.
You have to wonder why the general didn't confront Harry Hopkins.
Well, he worked hand in glove with Harry Hopkins, and I don't really understand his motivations. He's somebody I would like to study further, but I'm not happy with what I see, the patterns of his behavior. He tended to support Hopkins. He tended to much of the time, he tended to underscore whatever it was that Hopkins was pushing. And I don't know what his motivation was. I don't know if it was gratitude for his position. I don't know if he truly believed in Hopkins as a military genius. Hopkins, of course, was a social worker. He had absolutely no experience with the military. But lo and behold, by the time we get to World War II, when he moved into the White House for 3.5 years, living next door to Franklin Roosevelt in the private quarters.
That was the connection. That's why General Marshall, was so obedient to Harry Hopkins, because Hopkins had direct access to FDR.
Well, that's probably it. It's hard to fathom though, because it's just a disturbing point. Mm-hmm. It's a disturbing point of history that has not been yet resolved.
Okay, well, with General Patton, he was murdered after World War II. First of all, he was very angry about.
Yes, he was.
He was when the war came to a close. He was very angry about decisions that were being made in Europe, in Germany. He planned to come back to the USA and write a book, and there was a movement underway to draft General Patton for the White House, that he would run for president. But the great general never made it back to the United States alive because he was murdered. And
it seems that way. I know that there's a lot of evidence for that, and there's a wonderful book that tries to draw it all together, Targeting Patton.
Yes, I interviewed the author several times, and he actually spoke with the man on his deathbed, who was ordered by Donovan to kill General Patton.
Yeah.
Our own government killed General Patton.
Well, it's an ugly, ugly story, and the evidence for that is very, very disturbing. Patton's experience is kind of a microcosm of my book. This happened on many different levels. Patton's experience, in other words, he was slowed. He was purposefully, as you say, his hands were tied in prosecuting the war and moving too quickly. This is what I mean about the war could have ended earlier, and there was an effort on many levels to keep that war going until the point where the Soviet Union moved into Europe. This is what I became convinced of. And so, of course, General Patton racing across Europe, getting toward Germany, getting toward Czechoslovakia, and so on, too quickly, and being called to retreat, being called to stop, not being given gasoline, all of those things. That is just one vector of this betrayal. This was going on with, for example, the announcement of unconditional surrender as being the terms of any truce or any ending up to the war. Unconditional surrender, which was declared by Roosevelt in January of 1943, again, early, very early, this had the effect of ramping up German resistance. What do you do? Another unconditional surrender after what they'd gone through after the World War One. This would be amplified with the leak of something called the Morgenthau Plan, which was essentially a Soviet plot right there to put out into the public domain notions of what would happen to Germany if it surrendered too soon, I would argue. In other words, the Morgenthau Plan was, quote, to pastoralize Germany, in other words, to destroy all of its industry, to essentially make it a farming, agricultural country rather than an advanced nation. And the impact of this, it was known, would have starved to death millions of people in the aftermath. And actually, parts of the plan were put into effect, and many Germans did starve. Much slave labor of Germans was turned over to the Soviet Union, and so on. But the propaganda impact was recognized by American generals, including Roosevelt's own son-in-law, John Bettinger, who recognized the propaganda impact as simply pressing the Germans closer to the Nazi government for food, for support, for protection, in conjunction with the extremely punishing firebombing campaign that at this point was destroying German cities across the board. Now, I used to defend those firebombings as a necessary strategy of war, as horrible as they were. For example, Dresden, the very famous destruction of Dresden, which came, 2-3 months before the war actually ended, and killed about 40,000 people, and destroyed this seat of ancient civilization in Europe. John Keegan even discussed this in later years as having been basically a measure taken so that the Russian army could advance more easily through to other German destinations. I mean, this is again this notion of our policy, our strategy being hijacked by communist agents working for Stalin inside the U.S. government.
Diana, American industrialist Arm & Hammer. I mean,
yes.
Who in their right mind would name their little boy Arm & Hammer, the Arm and the Hammer of the Soviet Empire? But Arm & Hammer was an industrialist. He was one of the wealthiest men in America. He was also a Soviet agent. He was the financier of Reverend Robert Schuller. Did he play a role in any of these plots?
Yes, he did. Very important role. He was instrumental in getting the policy or the agency known as Lend-Lease off the ground. And this was something that Edward J. Epstein discovered. I cite Edward J. Epstein for this information. He wrote a groundbreaking biography of Hammer back in the 90s. Hammer was sort of shopping around the notion of Lend-Lease in Washington to the British at the embassy, to some congressmen and so on, and he finally got in to see Roosevelt in 1940, after the election in 1940, and pitched the idea, and it was called, I think, Ed Epstein calls it the 5-minute summit. He got in to make this pitch in, I think it was November of 1940. Harry Hopkins was commissioned to run up to New York a few times and hammer out some details. So you've got Soviet agent Hammer, you have Soviet agent Hopkins, and then lo and behold, the details would be worked out over at the Treasury Department under Harry Dexter White, Soviet agent. I argue that Lend-Lease then becomes the most Sovietized piece of legislation ever to pass in the American Congress. And I would actually like to read you just a little piece of what that legislation actually said. I'm just looking for it. It is, I should have pulled this up. It was basically, I'm just searching my document here.
Diana, while you're looking for it, while you're looking for it, we've got roughly about 7 minutes remaining. While you're looking for it, tell me, why were so many communists placed inside the USDA, the Department of Agriculture?
I think it was easy. I think it was considered the trap door, they called it. Somebody there, and I would have to look it up to see who that somebody was, whether it was I think it was originally the Ware Group, so it would have been Mr. Ware. I forget his first. I think Harold Ware was his name. He had enough power to, whoever it was, I think it was Ware, to bring people in, to hire people, and they actually ended up with a basically a cell forming there because it was easy, and that indeed is where Alger Hiss, I believe, got his start in U.S. government.
And Vice President Henry Wallace, who was a communist.
Well, he certainly was. I don't know if he had a card, but he certainly was a communist sympathizer and a very Sovietophile person. Yes,
that's good enough for me. He's a commie to me. That's
exactly.
I'm pretty loose with my classification, and
right. Well, I've got my quotation for you, which is that this was something essentially what we're looking at is the word interdependence. The bill itself talks about the interdependence of the American people with the other freedom-loving nations in the world. And this is a very important moment because, in a sense, it is abdicating our own independence of the world for this very UN-style notion, this globalist style of interdependence. And this is a defining principle of Lend-Lease, and indeed that language is in the bill itself.
Like Agenda 21.
Yes, and so you can call it really the day, March 11, 1941, I call it the day, America's Interdependence Day, and perhaps we can call it the first day of the new global order. And then we go forward to the end of the war, and we see the United Nations arise under the guidance of another Soviet agent named Alger Hiss. So all of these things do lock together, and it's a very ugly story, and again, kind of takes the rosy glow off our memories of the so-called Good War, which is how we look back on World War II. This was actually an intelligence war raging against the United States by our supposed ally, the Soviet Union.
And and perhaps you've read, I believe it was Colonel John Koster. He was on the program, and he wrote the book Operation Snow, how Soviet mole triggered Pearl Harbor.
Right.
And once again, we're talking about how FDR was manipulated by Soviet agents in the White House to enter World War II. So we're seeing this from different angles, but it's always the same story. And I got two questions I want to ask you before we run out of time. Yeah. Real quick, tell us the story about Dr. William Wirt in the 1930s who tried to warn the American people that there was a revolution underway.
Yes, William Wirt is a wrongly forgotten great American who I argue is actually the victim of the first American show trial. William Wirt came to our attention after he attended a dinner party in Washington that he found to be rife with talk of revolution. He was visiting with New Dealers. This was the fall of September of 1933, right after Roosevelt had come into office that year. And it was a heady time. It was very exciting for, this people enthused about the so-called Soviet experiment were here talking about how to bring it to the United States through collectivization of farming, which was going on at the Agriculture Department, planned economy, all of these things that people were trying to bring to America in a time of depression where people were quite desperate to try almost anything. And anyway, William Wirt heard this talk of the destruction of the country of Washington and Jefferson. This was something that he remembered from this talk. And he was so alarmed that he didn't know what to do, but he began writing letters to anyone he could think of, newspapers, famous people. One of them was a major industrialist of the day, James Rand, who was then testifying in Washington about the Wall Street reorganization that the New Deal was doing. And he actually read Dr. Wirt's letter into the congressional record and caused a major controversy, a furor. It was nationwide coverage of this incredible claim that the New Deal was a revolution, which it was. And Wirt, long story short, was finally brought to Washington to testify by this Democratic Congress. But what they did was set up basically a kangaroo court. He was not allowed to read his statement, which is customary. He was not allowed to have benefit of counsel, which is a Senate tradition. He was not allowed to call witnesses to ascertain whether he was right or not, whether what he was saying was true. And the other dinner party guests did testify, and they colluded, we find out later, in terms of making up a story that they all said under oath was the truth, that Wirt had talked nonstop and that there couldn't have been talk of revolution because he was such a nonstop talking bore. Flash forward some decades and we discover that 3 out of those 6 dinner party guests who testified, who perjured themselves against Dr. Wirt, were Soviet agents.
3 of the 6 people at the dinner were...
Besides Dr. Wirt. Yeah, there were 7 at the dinner.
Yes,
3
were confirmed later to be Soviet agents.
Yes.
Okay, now,
yes.
we got. I got to squeeze this in 2 minutes.
Sure.
So let's fast forward. It's now 2013. Barack Hussein Obama is in the White House. The IRS is persecuting conservatives, Tea Party groups, Christian groups, pro-life groups. They're spying on reporters. They're going after the gun rights of the American people. They've taken over the healthcare system, on and on and on and on. Are we witnessing the capstone of this revolution?
Yes. I mean, I think we are, and again, because we've been conditioned not to see this happening, I think most Americans would tell you they're still living in a capitalist-free country with all manner of liberty. The brainwashing, the conditioning that has been so successful and has demoralized us is definitely bringing us to this point of a certain kind of tyranny. Does not have at this point, does not have the gulag. It does not have people knocking at the door with guns yet. It does, however, make examples of truth tellers. It makes examples of people who cross the line, and this has served to tyrannize us. And we are experiencing this, and yet you ask most people, they'll say we won the Cold War. Well, I say, look, 100 million dead after the communist century, and Republicans who have the majority in Congress cannot muster the votes to repeal and defund socialized medicine. Who won the Cold War?
I think that needs to be the final word. Diana West. The book is American Betrayal, The Secret Assault on Our Nation's Character. You can buy the book at Amazon or any other bookstore, and her website is dianawest.com. Diana, thank you so much. I appreciate all that you've done to expose the lies.
Pleasure.